20th century England readily accepts the heir to the throne visiting a Hindu temple in London, however unthinkable it would have been to King Charles and most of his opponents. Most of us today agree that believers, whatever their faith, should be free to practice their religion without fear of persecution.
In the revolutionary period after Parliament's victory, England's first experiment with religious toleration took place. The king was under arrest. Censorship was suspended. Suddenly there was no state religion. In its place was a religious free-for-all.
Independent preachers with their own sects began to spring up everywhere. Rejecting established traditions, they even questioned the central tenets of the Christian faith.
There's no hell, all men will be saved.
The only hell is the fear and terror we endure on earth.
Feel the power.
Some sects allowed women to preach.
Christ is no more God than you or me. Every one of us is as much of God as Christ.
Some groups deliberately set out to shock, blasphemously baptizing cats or other animals, or walking about naked to recall the innocency of Adam. The new parliamentary government responded to this religious license with the same tactics the king had used to suppress Puritans.
Hands off, you have no authority! Come on, bring him out! This is no justice, this is tyranny!
They arrested sect leaders, seized their printing presses and burned their books. Responsible for this clampdown was the majority faction in Parliament, the Presbyterians. Their leader was Denzil Hollis, one of the MPs the king had tried to arrest. Now in place of Charles's Church of England, the Presbyterians imposed a national Puritan one. Sects that refused to participate in official church life would not be tolerated.
Open up! Freeborn Englishmen!
But already the struggle for greater tolerance had begun. At the heart of this movement was John Lilburne. After fighting courageously for Parliament, Lilburne came back to London and started a cloth trading business to support his wife Elizabeth and their children. But his heart wasn't in it. His anger at injustice was fired by the repressive conduct of the Presbyterian party. Lilburne began writing pamphlets, highly critical of the men he fought for a few months earlier. He argued vehemently that every individual should be free to believe what they chose without interference from the state.
The Presbyterians persecute all other religions. They set up arbitrary and illegal courts. They've induced people to fight in the name of freedom for what is tyranny in a new guise. And now they live in luxury, while thousands who gave up everything to serve their country haven't a piece of bread to put in their mouths. They live in abundance, while widows and fatherless children beg in the streets.
Open up!
A parliamentary committee ordered Lilburne's arrest for writing his leaflets. Lilburne delayed matters for several hours by disputing the warrant. Eventually he agreed to go. The Parliament for whom he had so recently risked his life now looked him up for treason.
When they sentenced me, these young soldiers came to take me. I warned them that it was illegal to lay a hand on me. You're Englishmen like me, I said, born and bred. Freedom and liberty are in our bones. We've been raised to defend those liberties, not destroy them. Because that's what they were doing by taking me. In making me a slave, they were subjecting themselves to slavery. If they did that, they were destroying their birthright. They were no better than cheap mercenaries. They took me anyway.
Prison couldn't keep Lilburne quiet. Illegal presses printed his writings. In jail, he received visits from his supporters. They became known disparagingly as the Levellers. They published a succession of politically radical pamphlets. The just man's justification. The free man's freedom vindicated. And England's birthright justified. All went further than just asking for religious freedom. They demanded that the rich pay more tax than the poor, and that everyone should be entitled to a fair trial. Parliament banned these pamphlets. The Levellers in turn despaired of reforming Parliament. They would have to look elsewhere to bring about change.
Colonel Lilburne will have no more truck with men of place or office. He will appeal directly to the common people and the private soldiers in the army.
In a world turned upside down by war, these Leveller pamphlets found a ready audience, especially in the army. A sense of grievance was growing among soldiers. Parliament was planning to send some of them to fight in Ireland and disband the rest. And many were members of religious sects which the Presbyterians were persecuting. But the biggest grievance was pay. Foot soldiers were owed 18 weeks of back pay and cavalry 43 weeks, a total of £313,000. The experience of these soldiers from Colonel Wally's regiment, veterans of Naseby and Marston Moor, was typical.
I'm John Hodgkins. I'm owed £24, 9 shillings.
Peter Large, £34, 19 and 10 pence.
Robert Osborne, £38 and 10 shillings I'm owed.
George Ash, £47, 10 shillings.
David Owen, I'm owed £32, 10 shillings and 6 pence.
The soldiers began organising themselves like a trade union. Each regiment elected representatives called agitators who petitioned their commanding officers about back pay and other grievances. These were extraordinary times. Men accustomed only to serve and obey started to demand rights. From his exile, watching and wondering at events, was Edward Hyde.
The king first called a parliament he could not control. Afterwards, Parliament raised an army it could not control. And now the army has agitators it cannot control. What the end will be, God only knows.
Cromwell was also concerned. He believed the current peace was fragile and the king would be quick to exploit any unrest in the army. He favoured religious toleration and was sympathetic to the soldiers' pay demands, but he regarded Lilburne's leaflets as an incitement to mutiny. In September 1647, Cromwell visited John Lilburne in prison. A fellow prisoner, Royalist Sir Lewis Dive, reported their conversation.
General Cromwell spoke fairly to Colonel Lilburne. "Cease attacking Parliament," he said, "and you will be set free." He urged patience, promised him honourable employment in the army, and said he would use his best endeavours with Parliament to secure his liberty.
Lilburne felt hopeful. But Cromwell did nothing. Soon Lilburne realised he'd been deceived. He turned implacably against the man he once hero-worshipped.
By now, John Lilburne felt he'd been betrayed by both his parliamentary and military leaders. So from his cell here in the Tower, he took an historic step. Simply complaining about the effects of tyranny was no longer enough. What was needed was a way of preventing it. So the Levellers decided to demand what today we consider our birthright, a government accountable to the people.
On the 28th of October, 1647, the Council of the Army met in secret at Putney Church. the council allowed agitators representing ordinary soldiers to put their concerns to the High Command. At these Putney debates, they discussed a series of fundamental issues, among them a written constitution. A number of the agitators were Leveller supporters. Some had been visitors of John Lilburne in prison. In the days before Putney, they had written a remarkable document called An Agreement of the People. It proposed limiting the power of the King and Parliament to pass laws that took away a citizen's rights. More radically, it proposed giving the vote to every adult male, and not just the 25% who currently had it on the basis of owning land. With John Lilburne in prison, his views would be represented by sympathetic soldiers, men like Colonel Thomas Rainsborough and Edward Sexby, a militant trooper in Fairfax's regiment. The Leveller document was a passionate cry for a more democratic England.
This is the agreement of the people. It lays down certain rules for government which we declare as our inalienable rights. We will do everything in our power to uphold them against all opposition. We deserve these rights, and we've waited too long for them.
The document's radical, but we mustn't be afraid of that. The proposals are just. History shows us that there have been many struggles between the honest men of England and those that have tyrannized them. All good laws come as innovation and as constraints upon the power of king and lords.
Cromwell arrived with his son-in-law Henry Ireton, Commissionary General to the army. At this stage, Cromwell was keen to placate the soldiers. His overriding concern was the unity of the army. Cromwell chaired the meeting. It began with a reading of the Agreement of the People. Its first proposal was so in advance of its time it would not be enacted until 1918.
We are fully agreed and resolved that the power of this and all future representatives of this nation is inferior to that of the people who chose them.
The poorest man in England has just as much of a life to lead as has the most powerful. It follows that any man who lives under a government must have the right to choose that government.
No person has the right to share in the government of his kingdom. Only those men with a permanent, fixed interest in this country have that right. The men that own the land, and the men that own the companies which are responsible for our trade.
I am a poor man, therefore I must be oppressed. If I have no interest in this kingdom, I must accept its laws, right or wrong.
The crux of the two-week-long debate was the franchise. The soldiers argued the sacrifice of the war could only be justified if tyrants could never again come to power. The best way to achieve this was by extending the right to vote.
Thousands of soldiers like myself have risked their lives for Parliament. We didn't fight because we owned property, we fought for our birthright. How can you say that unless you own property you have no rights in the country? I mean, we've all been deceived. If we have no rights in the kingdom, then soldiers are no better than mercenaries.
You must think where all this will lead.
Cromwell's chief concern was to find a compromise, and he said little. His views were forcibly put by Ireton. Everyone in the room believed in religious tolerance. The officers even agreed with the soldiers' demand for back pay. But for Cromwell and Ireton, anything more than a modest extension of the franchise was too much. Like most gentry, they feared it would lead to anarchy.
You say that every man has a right to elections, that this is a right of nature. Surely this right of nature would allow him to help himself to anything he sees. Meat, drink, clothes, to take any piece of land to till. This right of nature will destroy the very meaning of ownership.
The general says that if the poor are given their birthright and allowed to vote, that it will lead to the destruction of the kingdom. The poor preserved the kingdom. They risked their lives for it, and now they want their birthright.
No, that is not.
During the Putney debates, Cromwell seemed to go along with much of what the agitators said. He acknowledged that the Agreement of the People was a document worthy of further debate. promised to consult the soldiers at large and report back to the Army Council on all aspects of the future settlement.
When the agitators left the church here at Putney, they must have felt elated, on the brink of winning a famous agreement. But within weeks, Cromwell went back on his word. Reasserting control over the army, he ordered the agitators back to their regiments and disbanded the Army Council. The momentum was lost, and with it the best hope of creating government of the people, by the people, for the people. Cromwell had more pressing concerns than democracy. He had to deal with the king.